My father's company owned 7 freight trucks and 1 cargo van. I know this because I spent most of high school answering the office phone and writing down license plate numbers whenever drivers called in with problems. Busted taillights, low tire pressure, a coolant leak on Route 40 in the middle of February. He kept a laminated card taped above the dispatch phone with all 8 plates listed in his handwriting, and by the time I was 16, I had memorized every one of them. When I pulled the company's insurance records 18 months after my brother took over operations, there were 9 vehicles listed. 2 of them I'd never seen. Both were registered through an entity called Heartline Freight Partners, with a mailing address that turned out to be a UPS store in a strip mall 40 miles from any route my father had ever run. That was the first thing. To understand why it mattered, you have to understand what my father built and what it actually cost him to build it. His name is Howard Caulfield, though everyone in the regional freight industry just called him Caulfield. No first name, the way you earn a single-name reputation in a business where contracts run on handshakes and people remember who showed up when the roads were bad. He started his freight company in 1987 with 1 truck, a used International he bought at a fleet auction in Columbus for $11,000, and a commercial driver's license he'd passed on his 3rd attempt. He drove solo for almost 2 years before he could afford to bring on a second driver. By the time I was born, he had 6 trucks and a dispatch office out of a converted garage in Terre Haute. By the time I graduated college, he had contracts with 4 regional grocery chains, a medical supply distributor out of Indianapolis, and 12 full-time drivers who'd been with him long enough that some of them sent Christmas cards to our house. He was not a man who talked about what he'd built. He showed up early and stayed late and knew by voice every driver on his payroll, and he kept that laminated card above the phone because he believed that if you couldn't account for your own equipment at any hour of the day, you had no business running equipment. My brother Tanner is 4 years older than me. He joined the company after a stint in logistics software sales that lasted 18 months and ended in what he described, when pressed, as a mutual decision to move in different directions. My father brought him in as operations director in my final year of grad school. At the time, it seemed like the kind of obvious move that looks more logical than it actually is. Tanner was smart. Tanner had industry-adjacent experience. Tanner was already local while I was building toward a CPA license in Indianapolis. Nobody asked whether smart and experienced and available were the same as trustworthy. My father's Parkinson's diagnosis came 2 years ago. Early stage, his neurologist said, manageable, progressive, the kind of prognosis that means you have time to plan if you use it. The tremor in his right hand had already gotten bad enough that he'd stopped signing documents himself. He granted Tanner broad signatory authority on a temporary basis, with a verbal agreement that it would be reviewed every 6 months. In 18 months, it was never reviewed. I know because I asked, eventually, and nobody could point me to a single conversation where the topic had come up. I was not paying close attention to any of this during that time. I want to say that plainly, because there is a version of this story where I catch things earlier, where I'm more vigilant, where I don't spend 18 months assuming that Tanner has it handled because he sounds confident on the phone and my father seems comfortable. That version would have been better. I didn't live that version. I showed up for Sunday dinners and asked general questions and accepted general answers, and I let myself believe that busy and absent were the same as trusting. What changed it was a shred pile. I was home in January, helping my father sort through old billing files he wanted to get rid of. Paper records from before the company switched to digital, driver logs from the early 90s, the kind of accumulation you get in any office that's been running for 35 years. We spent a Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table going through boxes, him telling me which ones to keep and which ones to shred, and I came across a vendor invoice from 2021 that listed a fuel logistics surcharge from a company called Heartline Freight Partners. I set it aside without thinking about it. But the name caught somewhere in the back of my mind the way a word catches when you're almost sure you've never heard it before. Not because it was alarming, but because it was absent from a mental catalog I didn't even know I'd been keeping. I went home and looked it up. Heartline Freight Partners was registered as an LLC in Delaware in March of 2021, approximately 4 months after Tanner became operations director. It listed no website and no public phone number. Its registered agent was a corporate formation service in Wilmington. Its Indiana mailing address, the UPS store in Grover, matched the address listed on the insurance records for both unrecognized vehicles. The company had no documented clients, no visible employees, and no public business activity of any kind. I didn't call Tanner. I didn't mention it to my father. I opened a new spreadsheet and started writing everything down. I spent the next 3 weeks pulling together every financial record I could legally access. This was easier than it should have been. During a summer I'd spent helping my father digitize his old paper files. I'd been added to the company's cloud accounting platform. Tanner had never removed my login. I don't know if that was carelessness or arrogance, and I'm not sure it matters. I had access, and I used it quietly, during evenings after work, the way you do when you're not yet sure what you're looking for, but you know the shape of what doesn't belong. A law school acquaintance connected me with a forensic accountant named Dorothea Kwan, who ran a small practice out of Fort Wayne. I called her on a Tuesday, laid out what I had in broad terms, and she told me to bring everything and come in person. I drove up on a Thursday evening in February, with 2 inches of printed records in a manila folder, and the kind of low-grade dread that doesn't feel like fear. It feels like certainty arriving before you're ready for it. Dorothea walked me through what she was seeing, almost before I finished explaining. Heartline Freight Partners has received 31 payments from your father's company over the past 26 months, she said, sliding a printed ledger across her desk. They're categorized across 3 expense codes: equipment leasing, fuel logistics, and fleet maintenance consulting. The total is $4.1 million. I asked her what the company actually did for that money. She showed me. Heartline's only documentable activity, as far as she could trace, was subleasing 2 trucks back to my father's company. For routes the company was already running with its own drivers, at markup rates that exceeded comparable market pricing by between 60 and 90%, depending on the quarter. The trucks themselves were titled to a shell entity registered in Nevada. The Nevada entity, after 2 layers of pass-through LLCs, traced back to a man named Glenn Sutherland, my brother's college roommate, a man who had been a guest at our family's kitchen table during more summers than I could count. We spent 3 months on this. Twice a week, Thursday evenings, Dorothea's office, running through records and cross-referencing payments against publicly available freight rate data, corporate filings, and county business registration documents. She was meticulous and unhurried, and she never told me what she thought I should do with what we found. She just showed me what was there. By April, we had documented $4.1 million in payments to Heartline. We had also found $890,000 in consulting fees paid to 2 additional vendors with no traceable business activity, both of which cross-referenced back to Sutherland through a Nevada holding company. Total documented, $4.99 million routed out of my father's company over 26 months through a structure that had been specifically designed to look like routine operating expenses. I want to say I was surprised by the scale. I wasn't. By March, I had stopped being surprised by anything and started operating in a mode that felt less like investigation and more like assembly. Finding the next piece, fitting it to the last one, not looking ahead at what the finished picture would mean until I had enough of it to be sure. I still did not move. My father's company had been in negotiations since the previous fall to sell a 30% minority stake to a regional freight consolidator out of Cincinnati. The closing was set for a Friday in May, and the purchase agreement included a standard audit condition. The buyer's due diligence team would have 60 days to review the company's financials before the deal finalized. I understood what that meant. The moment outside auditors opened the books under a contractual obligation, what I had wasn't a daughter's accusation. It was confirmation of what an independent review was already going to surface. I had spent 3 months building something that would look exactly like corroborating evidence when the time came, and I was not going to use it before it could look that way. So I waited. Tanner flew to Cincinnati in late April to sign the preliminary agreements. He called me from the airport on his way back, loose and pleased in the way he gets when something has gone well. He said the deal was good for the company. He said Dad would be proud once he understood the full picture. He asked if I was coming down for our mother's birthday that weekend. I said yes. I sat with my father on the back porch on Saturday afternoon and watched him work slowly to open a pull tab on a soda can, and I helped him and I said nothing. Not because I was protecting Tanner. Because I needed my father to see this resolved, not just hear about it mid-process. Not while Tanner still had operational control and the ability to destroy records or transfer assets, or do any of the half-dozen things I had quietly researched as possibilities. He had built that company over 37 years. He deserved to see it defended correctly. The Cincinnati deal closed on a Thursday in May. The audit team arrived Monday morning. On Tuesday, I was sitting in the conference room at my father's company, a room where I had eaten birthday cake at my father's retirement party that never quite happened. A room where I had watched him shake hands with his first major grocery chain client when I was 9 years old, with Dorothea beside me and a binder 2 inches thick in front of every board member and the company's outside counsel. I laid it out the way Dorothea had prepared me to, methodically in order, with source documents behind every claim. Here's the vendor name. Here's the payment date and amount. Here's the registered agent. Here's the entity that owns the trucks. Here's what the market rate for this service was in this quarter. Here's what the company paid instead. 31 payments. 4 expense categories. $4.99 million across 26 months. The board's outside counsel asked for a recess after 40 minutes. I sat in the hallway with Dorothea and drank bad coffee from the machine near the bathrooms and looked through the window at the parking lot where I used to wait in my father's truck when he had late calls to finish, small enough then that I could fall asleep across the back seat without my feet reaching the door. The recess lasted 90 minutes. When I was called back in, the company's legal team had already placed a call to Tanner's personal attorney. Within 3 weeks, Heartline Freight Partners and its related entities were named in a civil complaint. Within 6, Tanner's signatory authority was suspended pending a full internal investigation, and Glenn Sutherland was named as a co-respondent in the action. Both of the truck entities connected to the Nevada LLC were frozen. The board brought in an interim operations director, a woman named Marguerite Hollins, who had run freight operations for a competitor in the region for over 15 years. And within 8 weeks, on-time delivery performance across the company's remaining routes had improved to its highest rate in 3 years. Tanner called me 3 days after the board vote. He did not come to my apartment. He has never been the kind of person who shows up somewhere he hasn't confirmed he'll be received. He called at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday, which told me he'd been awake for a while working up to it. His first word was my name, not hello. Just my name, the way someone says a name when they want to establish that they're being direct with you. I said I was listening. You don't know what the company looked like from the inside, he said. The Cincinnati group wasn't interested 18 months ago. The banks weren't moving on an expansion loan with Dad's diagnosis in the file. Sutherland's arrangement gave us operating capital we couldn't get anywhere else, and I used it to hold the whole thing together while you were in Indianapolis finishing your certification. I let him finish. You used Dad's money, I said without telling him. He was quiet. He would have said no, Tanner said. I know, I said. That's why you didn't tell him. He said the structure was meant to be temporary. He said Sutherland was owed something for years of informal consulting and industry connections that had helped land 2 of the company's major contracts. He said the numbers looked damaging out of context, but that in context, if you understood what had been at stake, there was a reasonable argument to be made. I told him that I did understand the context. I had spent 3 months building a thorough understanding of it, and the context was that my father's company had paid nearly $5 million to entities my brother controlled through a structure specifically designed to prevent detection, without my father's knowledge or consent, during a period when my father had trusted him with everything he'd spent 37 years building. Tanner was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's not going to handle this well, Dad. You know that. Whatever time he has left, he's going to spend watching this play out in depositions and courtrooms, and that's on you." I had thought about this too. I had thought about it in February when I first found the insurance records. I had thought about it in March when Dorothea showed me the payment totals. I had thought about it every night in April when I sat with my father and helped him with the things his hands couldn't do anymore and said nothing about what I knew. I had thought about it carefully enough that I no longer had anything new to think about it. "He's going to watch it get fixed," I said. "That's not the same thing as what you said." Tanner said his lawyers would be in touch and ended the call. The civil case against Sutherland settled 14 months later. Of the $4.99 million, approximately $3.4 million was recovered through frozen accounts and the liquidation of the truck entities. Tanner's own exposure was resolved through a negotiated settlement that required him to repay $890,000. The consulting fees his attorneys could not account for, and permanently barred him from serving as an officer, director, or signatory agent of the company. He did not face criminal prosecution, a fact that took me longer to make peace with than I expected. The U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed the referral and declined to pursue charges. I understand the calculation. I don't have to like it. He sent me a letter 7 months after the settlement. Not an apology, something more careful than that. An acknowledgement that he had made decisions he could not defend under examination, and that he understood, reading through the documents his own attorney had compiled for the settlement negotiations, the difference between protecting an organization and taking from it. He wrote that he had not thought of those as two separate things until they were laid out side by side in a conference room in his own father's building. I read the letter twice and put it in the same folder where I keep the original Heartline invoice. The one I'd set aside in January while helping my father decide what was worth keeping. My father still has his company. His name is still on the building on Wabash Avenue and on the door of the satellite office that opened in Evansville this past spring. A location he'd been talking about adding for years, a smaller operation to surface routes in the southwest part of the state, the kind of patient, ground-level expansion that had always been his style. He was at the ribbon cutting in April, in his good coat, shaking hands with the Evansville city councilman, with the hand that still cooperated, smiling the way he smiles when he's somewhere he belongs and isn't thinking about the fact that anyone's watching. Marguerite had arranged a small display near the entrance of the new office, a framed photograph from 1989, my father standing in front of his second truck, in a flannel shirt and work boots, squinting into the sun with the expression of a man who has no idea yet how far this is going to go. She had pulled it from a box of old company records with no explanation. She had simply framed it and hung it and let it be there. I stood in front of it for a long time. I thought about a laminated card taped above a dispatch phone, 8 license plate numbers in my father's handwriting, a catalog I'd memorized without trying, because I'd grown up inside the shape of what he built. I thought about a January afternoon and a vendor invoice in a shred pile and the way a name catches in the back of your mind when something is missing that should be there. I had not outmaneuvered my brother. I had simply paid a different kind of attention. The kind you can only pay if you already know what the place looked like before someone started rearranging it. My father had built something for 37 years, and in the process had handed me a working knowledge of every piece of it. Not because he intended to, but because he'd never kept any of it secret. He showed up. He stayed late. He kept the card above the phone. All I had done was read it.